Rudolf II of the Habsburg dynasty ruled the Holy Roman Empire at the end of the 16th century. Unlike most monarchs of his time, he had little interest in politics or war. What truly fascinated him was knowledge. He believed that power over the world could come not through armies but through understanding the secrets of creation. This belief shaped one of the strangest courts in European history. In his castle in Prague, Rudolf built a private museum that would later be known as the Kunstkammer. At first it looked like any other royal collection: rare minerals, exotic instruments, strange animals brought from overseas. But the emperor's curiosities soon crossed into something darker. He began ordering his agents to search for what he called God's mistakes. Deformed animals, human remains, malformed fetuses, and preserved organs were sent to Prague from every corner of Europe. They were packed in barrels of alcohol and sealed in glass jars that lined the shelves of his private chambers. Over time the place stopped resembling a gallery and became something closer to a morgue. Witnesses described rows of containers filled with half-formed bodies and human parts, each labeled in Latin and carefully arranged by category. Some jars contained infants that had never taken a breath, others held bones that still carried fragments of flesh. Scholars cataloged them like scientific treasures, measuring skulls, drawing diagrams, and discussing them in the same tone they used for art or astronomy. For Rudolf, this was not grotesque. It was revelation. He believed that every deformity was a clue, proof that the world had been created through trial and error. The emperor often inspected his collection in silence, surrounded by physicians and natural philosophers. He could spend hours staring at a jar until his servants began to sweat from the smell of spirits in decay. He did not flinch. He saw beauty in it. To him, these were not corpses but unfinished works of divine design, evidence that God himself could make errors and that man could correct them through knowledge. Foreign visitors left Prague disturbed. Ambassadors wrote home describing the emperor as detached and increasingly unstable. They said his castle had the atmosphere of a laboratory mixed with a tomb. What shocked them most was that Rudolf saw no contradiction between religion and death. He prayed inside that chamber, convinced that studying the broken shapes of life brought him closer to the mind of the Creator. By the 1590s, the Kunstkammer held hundreds of specimens. Servants complained about the constant smell of alcohol and the insects drawn to it. Courtiers avoided the area entirely. But Rudolf continued to expand it. He called the collection his mirror of the world and refused to let anyone question its purpose. The more his empire fell into disarray, the more he withdrew into that room of silent glass. He had become both ruler and custodian of decay, a man governing a world made of flesh that could no longer rot because it was already dead. The deeper Rudolf sank into his collection, the more his fascination turned toward a single question. If life could be preserved inside glass, could it also be restored? The Kunstkammer was no longer enough. Surrounded by silent bodies that would never move again, the emperor began to imagine a way to break that silence. What began as study soon became a search for resurrection. Underneath the castle of Prague, new rooms were built, a network of cellars filled with furnaces, glass instruments, and boiling mixtures. These were not workshops for gold or weapons but laboratories meant to challenge death itself. Rudolf invited alchemists from across Europe, men who spoke in symbols and promised that matter could be reborn. Some were scholars, others were frauds, but all were welcomed. The emperor no longer cared who they were, as long as they claimed to know how to make flesh live again. The work that followed blurred the line between science and ritual. Substances taken from the dead were mixed with chemicals, oils, and metals. The same jars that once served as trophies in the Kunstkammer became tools for experimentation. Witnesses spoke of organs soaked in elixirs, bones polished with mercury, and blood boiled with silver dust. The goal was not wealth but transformation. Rudolf believed that if base metals could turn into gold, then decay itself could be purified into life. The basement became a city of fire. Furnaces burned day and night, glass retorts burst from pressure, and the corridors filled with the smell of acid and smoke. Servants were forbidden to enter without covering their faces. Some alchemists fell ill from the fumes, a few never returned from their experiments at all. Still, the emperor ordered the work to continue. He said that corruption was not a curse but a stage of creation, that rot was only matter waiting for a new command. Above ground, his empire was collapsing. Ministers waited weeks for decisions that never came, letters from foreign courts went unanswered, and rumors spread that the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire had lost his mind. Inside the castle, however, Rudolf felt closer than ever to his goal. He kept every failed experiment, every jar that cracked, every organ that refused to change. He said they were witnesses to the struggle between death and perfection. Historians later described this period as the peak of his isolation. While Europe saw war and reformation, the emperor of millions spent his nights staring into glass, convinced that he was on the edge of divine discovery. He had already stopped believing in religion, and now he was learning not to believe in decay. What he did not see was that his own body had begun to reflect the things he studied. His skin grew pale, his health declined, and his mind became as fragile as the glass that surrounded him. By the early years of the 17th century, Rudolf's empire was divided not only by politics but by the strange world he had built inside his castle. The Kunstkammer and the alchemical basements had merged into one vision. To him, there was no border between the study of death and the exercise of power. He began inviting his courtiers, foreign ambassadors, and visiting nobles to private gatherings that were unlike anything seen in Europe. They were not feasts of diplomacy or celebration. They were exhibitions of what he called the full image of creation. In the great hall of Prague Castle, long tables were set not only with gold and silver but with glass vessels brought up from his collection. Between the trays of food stood jars containing preserved creatures and human remains. Scholars presented them as curiosities, explaining each one as a message from nature itself. Guests were expected to admire them as if they were works of art. The emperor watched their reactions closely. Those who looked away or showed disgust rarely received another invitation. For Rudolf, acceptance of the grotesque was a test of loyalty. These gatherings grew more disturbing over time. Dwarfs, hunchbacks, and people born with deformities were brought from across the empire to serve at the emperor's table. Rudolf believed that their presence represented the variety of God's creation, proof that even imperfection had a purpose. They were dressed in fine clothes, forced to stand beside jars holding bodies that looked like distorted versions of their own. Some courtiers called it the emperor's living gallery. Others whispered that it was a masquerade of madness. Reports from foreign diplomats describe an atmosphere both magnificent and unbearable. Music played while servants poured wine, yet the air was heavy with the sharp scent of chemicals from the laboratory below. Ambassadors wrote that they saw the emperor lift a cup of wine and speak about transformation, comparing the decay of flesh to the fermentation of grapes. He said that life itself was a series of controlled corruptions. Many guests pretended to agree, afraid of appearing ignorant in front of a ruler who could dismiss or imprison them without reason. As his health declined, Rudolf became less concerned with appearances. He spoke openly about his experiments and asked his guests whether they believed the soul could survive outside the body. When they hesitated, he said that he would soon prove it. Some of the jars he displayed were said to contain the remains of executed criminals. Others, according to later testimonies, were taken from stillborn infants sent from city hospitals. Whether or not these rumors were true, they shaped the emperor's image across Europe. The court of Prague became a symbol of decadence and blasphemy, a place where science, faith, and death existed in the same room. By this point Rudolf was almost completely detached from political life. His brothers plotted to remove him, nobles avoided his invitations, and the imperial treasury was nearly empty. But the feasts continued. The emperor saw them not as entertainment but as ritual. Each gathering was his way of proving that he understood creation better than those who judged him. Surrounded by scholars, servants, and preserved bodies, Rudolf declared that decay was not the enemy of life but its architect. To those who watched him speak, it was clear that the emperor who once ruled Europe now ruled only a kingdom of glass, silence, and rot. In the final decade of his life, Rudolf II had withdrawn almost completely from the world. The palace that once served as the political center of an empire now resembled a sealed tomb. The council chambers were empty, the courtyards silent, and the guards no longer saluted when he passed. The emperor had turned his entire existence inward. His health was failing, his hands trembled, and he was often seen carrying small objects from his collection like relics. Among them was a human skull that he kept on his desk, polished and clean, which he called his silent advisor. Those who served him said he spoke to it during the night. Sometimes he asked questions about eternity, sometimes he whispered fragments of prayers. He claimed that the skull helped him concentrate. It was said that he could stare at it for hours without moving, convinced that inside the hollow bone remained a trace of a human soul. For Rudolf, death had become a partner rather than an enemy. He had spent his youth trying to understand creation, and his old age trying to make peace with what came after it. The skull became the centerpiece of his private rituals. Alchemists and priests were no longer invited. The emperor preferred solitude. He kept candles burning at all hours and filled the room with charts, diagrams, and jars of failed experiments. Each morning, he ordered his servants to polish the skull with oil and place it facing east. When they asked why, he said that the dead should look toward the rising sun. Over time, even his physicians grew uneasy. They no longer treated his body, only obeyed his strange routines. Outside the castle walls, the empire was falling apart. Conflicts between Catholics and Protestants deepened, and his relatives openly prepared to remove him from the throne. But Rudolf refused to leave Prague. He signed decrees only when forced and spent most of his time in the room with his skull and papers. Letters from other rulers went unanswered. Foreign diplomats were turned away. Those who managed to see him described a pale, swollen man surrounded by jars, muttering that life was a circle that always returned to dust. In his final years, even the servants began to believe that the emperor was no longer entirely sane. They said that some nights he ordered them to bring one of the preserved bodies from his collection and place it beside his chair. He called them witnesses, saying they were proof that matter could survive beyond death. Whether these accounts were true or exaggerated by fear, they reflected what his court had become, a place where knowledge and decay were indistinguishable. By 1611, Rudolf was completely isolated. His brother Matthias had taken control of the empire, and the emperor's authority existed only on paper. The once powerful ruler now lived surrounded by silence, staring at glass, convinced that he had discovered truths too dangerous for others to understand. When his health collapsed in January 1612, he was found sitting at his desk with the skull before him. The candle beside it had burned down to the table. Witnesses later said that the air in the room was thick with the smell of alcohol and that the emperor's last words were about light. Whether that was true or not, no one could deny that the man who ruled through decay had finally joined the collection he had built. After Rudolf's death, the castle in Prague became a monument to everything he had feared and worshipped at the same time. The rooms he once filled with scholars and specimens were sealed for weeks. Servants refused to clean them until the smell of chemicals and rot had faded. When the doors were finally opened, what they found inside looked more like a laboratory abandoned in the middle of an experiment than the home of an emperor. Tables were covered with glass jars, some cracked, others leaking the liquid that had preserved their contents. Drawers were full of notes written in several languages, many of them unreadable, filled with sketches of bones, measurements, and fragments of strange formulas. His brother Matthias, who took the throne after him, ordered that most of the collection be removed. Some items were sent to Vienna, others quietly destroyed. The church insisted that certain objects were unholy and should never have existed. But a few scholars argued that the Kunstkammer should be preserved as evidence of the emperor's genius. In the following decades, pieces of Rudolf's collection began to appear in other royal museums. Specimens labeled with his seal were found in universities from Italy to Holland. Many were misidentified as medical samples, while others simply disappeared into private archives. For historians, Rudolf's reign became a warning about the danger of knowledge without limits. Yet his influence on science was undeniable. The artists and natural philosophers he had sponsored went on to shape early anatomy, astronomy, and chemistry. Some of the instruments built for his laboratories helped develop new methods of observation. Even his obsession with deformity forced Europe to look at the human body differently, not only as a vessel of perfection but as a field of endless variation. What had once been called madness slowly turned into part of the modern pursuit of science. Still, the image that survived was not of progress but of decay. Travelers who visited Prague decades later wrote that parts of the old castle still carried the smell of spirits. Locals said that on quiet nights, the windows of the upper floors glowed faintly, as if the furnaces beneath were burning again. In popular tales, Rudolf became the emperor who tried to resurrect the dead, a man punished by his own curiosity. Some stories claim that his ghost wandered the castle, still searching for the philosopher's stone, still whispering to the skull on his desk. Modern historians see Rudolf as both a product and a victim of his time. He ruled during an age when Europe stood between religion and reason, between the Middle Ages and science. His life reflected that struggle in its purest form. He wanted to understand creation so completely that he lost his ability to live within it. The emperor who once ruled millions died alone, surrounded by glass and silence, remembered not for his wars or his politics but for the moment he tried to touch the line between life and death and left his fingerprints on both.